We're going to test a bunch of discs to find out which are the most like the Innova Thunderbird. But the question is, why? Hey everyone, it's Greg from Six Sided Discs. I want to present to you a very real scenario that I encounter frequently at our pop-up shops. People come up to me often looking for a specific type of disc. Let's say a reliably overstable but fairly straight fairway driver, like perhaps the Innova Thunderbird. So I might find a disc like the Thunderbird, hand it to them, and they feel it and they say, you know, I like the shape, I like the idea of it, but what other options do you have? At which point I want to find them options. Now, flight numbers are handy for this, but as we've shown, flight numbers don't matter, and they don't always tell the whole story. And in the case of the Thunderbird, they are particularly unhelpful. I recently had a customer asking about a Thunderbird replacement, so I took some time to go through all of our shelves that we had displayed, and I could not find a single disc with the same flight numbers. So I went to our website and I searched, and I couldn't find a single disc with the same numbers. So I decided to head to trydiscs.com, not a sponsor, to see what other discs are actually out there that share the numbers with the Thunderbird. And I was surprised to learn that there are only two: the Gateway Diablo and the Lone Star Madcat. Now, there's a couple others that are close, like the DGA Pipeline or the Latitude 64 Honor that was recently released. But after those, you start to get into some kind of murky territory where it starts recommending other Innova fairway drivers that obviously aren't designed to fly the same as a Thunderbird, or maybe some 7502 discs or 95 -12 discs. And that's where we started to question what discs actually fly like a Thunderbird. So we're on the hunt for the next best thing. Can we find a disc, regardless of the flight numbers, that actually flies pretty similar to a Thunderbird? Before we get too far though, let's find out how should a Thunderbird fly from the man himself, Big Germ.
The reason this disc was made was because they wanted to take the T-Bird and give it destroyer distance. Yeah. And even though it's a 9-speed, I found in field work that this is only coming up just a bit short. This thing is engineered to go down the fairway with little turn, little fade, but if you go hard and flat, I mean, this thing just goes hard and long stretch.
Okay, so destroyer distance with T-Bird control. That sort of description is only helpful if you know what a T-Bird and a destroyer do. So let's see if we can break it down into three primary flight characteristics. We want to see a disc that has little to no high-speed turn. We want to see that disc hold straight for about 2/3 of the flight. And we also want to see some reliable, low-speed fade. Based on how these discs fly for us, we're going to plot them on this graph here as either more or less overstable, or with more or less glide. We have just a few discs that we're going to be testing, and to help us test those, we have two advanced players. Max is Mac from our Destroyers video, he's rated 984, and we also have Caleb, rated 921. First, here's a couple discs we were told to test that didn't quite fit the Thunderbird slot. The Discraft Undertaker, Castoplast Lots, and Infinite Dynasty all have nearly the same flight numbers as each other, 95 -12, and honestly, they fly more like that. They were much straighter and in some cases even understable, and we're just never going to fill a Thunderbird slot. We also tested the Escape from Dynamic Discs, which was way more understable than the Thunderbird and was just never even worth putting on our graph. Finally, I had high hopes for the MVP Volt. We tested it in a couple different plastics, and for whatever reason, it was just not consistent for us. I know a lot of people really like the Volt. I'm not sure why we were having trouble with it. The Fission Volt says that it's more understable, but it's actually a bit more overstable than the Neutron Volt that we tested. And we decided, since they were kind of all over the place, they didn't really belong in this video. Maybe we'll do a separate one about the Volt. So with all of that in mind, why don't we actually get on to the discs that did make the chart? The first is the Thought Space Athletics Coalesce. The Coalesce is a newer release with flight numbers of 9503. It's pretty close to the Thunderbird, and reviewers online have been saying that it's not quite a 3 fade, which told us that we needed to test it. And I have to say, I'm pretty impressed. Max wasn't a huge fan of the plastic, which on these is the Nebula Ethereal Thomas Gilbert Tour Series edition, but on each throw it held very straight until it finally faded out. Overall, we'd say it has a similar stability to the Star Thunderbird, but a little less glide and distance. Next up, we tested the Wrath from Axiom Discs. The Wrath did a great job of holding a straight line. It is rated with less glide, and we would agree it definitely flew with less glide than the Thunderbird, but it still had a really nice flight overall. Max and Caleb weren't blown away by it, but they definitely didn't dislike it. And the ones we tested were in neutron plastic, so I'd say if you're an MVP fan looking for a sort of Thunderbird-ish slot, the Wrath is going to be pretty close, but not the closest that we tested. The Clash Disc Ginger is definitely a candidate as well. The plastic is relatively stiff, but feels very durable, though it is more expensive than your average Star plastic disc, anywhere between $3 to $7 more at retail. In terms of flight though, the Ginger had noticeably less glide, which is fair because the flight numbers do say it has less glide, but it was reliably overstable at the end. Now the S-Line PD is a very strong candidate. It felt great and it flew great too, and this sort of makes sense that it would be similar because S-Line plastic is very similar to Star plastic. It was previously manufactured by Innova, though we are testing one of the Discmania manufactured ones. We would say this is very close in flight to a Star Thunderbird. It's definitely a hair faster and a tiny bit more overstable, but very similar glide. The C-Line PD, on the other hand, is a total beefcake. This is going to be way off a Star Thunderbird, way more like a Champion or Tour Series Thunderbird that's brand new and much more overstable. We also didn't really see as much glide from our C-Line PD either. So if you're looking for a very, very, very overstable Thunderbird type disc, the C-Line PD might be the way to go. The Latitude 64 Honor is a new release coming in that beautiful, brand new, grand plastic from the Royal line at Latitude. It has very nearly the exact same flight numbers, 2.5 fade instead of 2. And in terms of feel, both Max and Caleb seemed to really like it, but they both kind of struggled to get a consistent release from it, as Caleb seemed to be letting it go a little early, and Max had a couple of grip locks on it as well. As far as its flight goes, it flew really well, despite the grip lock. On both shots, it held and held and held before a nice, generous fade. If anything, it's probably a little more overstable than the average Thunderbird, somewhere between a Star Thunderbird and a Champion Thunderbird. Next up, we have the Onyx from Discraft, and at 10603, it doesn't really sound like it should fly similar to a Thunderbird, but then again, many of these have had completely different flight numbers. The Onyx, though, is maybe more true to its numbers because it's just not quite the same in every way. It definitely flew a bit faster, it definitely had a bit more glide, it also turned a touch more, and then it faded a bit more as well. So maybe not a great substitute for a Thunderbird, but if you prefer a slightly chunkier rim, maybe you would prefer the Onyx. So what about the two discs that actually have the exact same flight numbers? Let's start with the Lone Star Mad Cat. Now, we didn't have any of these in stock, so a huge shout out to our friend Dontavius for loaning us his Lone Star Glow Mad Cat. I'm afraid, though, the thanks sort of end there, because the Mad Cat was way more overstable than your average Thunderbird, and we found it also had quite a bit less glide. The glow plastic is also surprisingly soft. Max in particular didn't really care for it, but if you prefer a softer plastic, you might like it. And there are stiffer versions. For example, Lone Star Alpha Plastic has a little more integrity to it. The other disc that shares the exact same flight numbers is the Gateway Diablo. We also didn't have any of these in stock, so shout out to another friend, Elijah, for loaning this one to us for the video. This one is in diamond plastic, and I can't really repeat what Max said when I asked him what he thought of this plastic. We can, however, talk about the flight. And this is sort of the opposite side of the spectrum to the Mad Cat. The Diablo was definitely less stable than your average Thunderbird. Maybe more like a G-Star Thunderbird, though I suspect not quite that understable. But we wouldn't really say it's deserving of the same numbers as a Thunderbird. So where does that leave us? What disc actually flew the most like a Thunderbird? Enter the Discraft Vulture. The Vulture was a huge surprise to me personally, as it certainly isn't the most popular Discraft mold. In fact, it's probably not even the most popular Thunderbird-ish mold from Discraft, as we sell way more Onyx than we do Vultures. However, we found it to be really close in terms of stability and glide and just overall feel and flight. It might be just a hint more overstable in Z plastic, but thankfully Discraft have a ton of options for plastic. Z, Big Z, ESP, or different Tour Series editions, and that's before you get into really obscure runs from Ledgestone, for example. After testing about 20 discs total, I asked Max and Caleb point blank what disc would they choose as the most similar to the Thunderbird, and they both chose the Vulture. The next best options were the S-Line PD from Discmania, the ThoughtSpace Athletics Coalesce, and the Latitude 64 Honor. Now remember, there are tons of different things that affect the flight of a disc, from the plastic, the specific run, the weight, the wind, and so many other factors. There's no replacement for going out and throwing these discs for yourself. Most importantly, remember, flight numbers don't matter. For Six-Sided Discs, I'm Greg. We'll see you in the next one. If you like this content and want to see more, please consider liking the video, subscribing to our channel, or supporting us on Patreon. Your support makes this content possible.